I'm supporting the power steering with some straps. All we have left so we can get the oil pan off is to take the front differential off the left side and the axle extension for the right side. This is the oil fill dipstick. I've pulled it out of the pan. You want to do that before you try to bring the pan down. Make sure the grounding cable's loose. And then, like the other side, there's just a little bit of a rubber seal on the insert. Depending on what you're repairing, you may not need to move the steering rack. But I want to get the steering rack out of the way to make sure that I can get the pan clear, as well as when I reinstall the pan, that I can get it on straight. So this pinch bolt for the steering column holds this in, and this is keyed. It only goes in one way. So this is an effective way to disconnect all the lower steering from the upper, and it actually works out pretty good. The upper can have it just rest on this engine mount, and it should stay out of our way to do oil pan. This way I can have the steering rack move down a little bit and move forward out of the way of the pan so the pan can come down. There's a lot of play in the upper. It might seem like you can pull this, but if it comes too far out, then it will become disconnected. Okay, I got 19 short screws, 4 real long ones, and 2 medium length ones. And 3 Torx bolts that holds the bell housing to the pan. Took them all out. So the dipstick, I can only pull the dipstick so high. Trying to get these transcooler lines out of the way without bending them too much. Getting ready to put the new gasket and pan back on. You want to make sure you put a little bit of gasket sealant at the 4 seams of the block to make sure you have a good seal there. I've cleaned off the old crust and the old gasket material, so I'm going to put a small bead at the corners, put this back up. So we're getting ready to put the subframe back on. These are the lower arm bushings. They bolt on here. If you're replacing these, what I want to recommend is to use an impact to get them off. You have a better chance of not breaking them, because I did break the outside one over here. I got the front subframe cleaned up. New motor mounts installed on the subframe. New front control arm bushings. I still need to do the inner tie rod on the steering. So what I think I'm going to do is get this under the car and put the steering rack, install it back in the subframe, so then I can get the inner tie rods out. So we're going to change the tie rod here. This is the outer tie rod, and the inner goes to about here. So to do that, we take off this rubber boot, put the new inner in, put new stainless steel clamps on. These clamps, if you loosen the crimp, then you can lift them off their hook, and then it'll be free. We'll do the same one for the crimp in here, and then we'll be able to take this boot off. So we have the boot crimp ring off, and I've pulled the boot back. This is the inner tie rod. This will come loose, and then we can put the new inner tie rod on. If you're doing this and you don't want to, or you're not able to drop the subframe, you can do this while you're on the car, but to make sure you have enough room, you probably want to disconnect the tie rod and then turn the wheel all the way to the direction of the one you want to service. And that should get you past the subframe, give you more room to work, because you're going to be higher. So I'm going to loosen this, put the new one on, crimp the clamps, and the new inner tie rod is done. And then once we're putting the wheel back together, we'll put the outer on and align the wheels. I got the new inner tie rods installed. I reinstalled the front subframe, put in new motor mounts, made sure the front diff is reinstalled. I changed the front diff plugs, but I'm not going to put oil in it until I have the axle inserted. I'm going to insert the axle once I know all the suspension is going to go back together. But first, we're going to turn our attention to transmission. So this 325xi has a automatic transmission, and the E46 wagons from 2001-2005 have a GM automatic transmission. I degreased this because this was leaking a lot of transmission fluid. I degreased this because I want to see if it's leaking once we get it back together. This guy takes long life Dexron 3. There's a specific Texaco long life transmission oil that they don't really make anymore because you can just use Dex 6, as far as I understand. I know there's a lot of opinions on that out there. We're going to drop the pan. We're going to change the seal. We're going to change the filter because we have the pan down. And I'm going to replace the fluid with Redline D4 ATF. I think it's going to be fine. I think my main concern is leaking, so hopefully we won't see any new leaks. So I'm going to loosen all the bolts, and then I'm going to take most of them out, and then I'll bring the pan down. I've already drained it with the drain plug, so this shouldn't be too messy. I just have bolts at the four corners, and they're loose. The pan isn't falling down at all, so we'll see what a little bit of vibration does. You don't want to pry the pan, because then it won't be flat. You won't get a good seal anymore. So the one side came down a little bit. There we are. So now if I support the pan, I take these bolts out, it'll just come right down. Fluid draining out of the filter. This corner has more dirt and oil. I'm kind of thinking that might have been the one leaking. Here's the bottom of the pan. Some discoloration, some sediment. It's pretty dark in color. Magnet looks pretty good. So I'm going to clean this up and we'll get the new stuff on. One of the things that I think was part of the thumping and irregularity in driving the car was 0 to 20. There was the knocking in the rear end, and I don't really think that it was the rear subframe. I think it was the drive shaft. This is the centering support bearing. It's torn out of the loop that supports it, and that's a common problem that causing the kind of thumping that I was hearing. So there is enough back together where we can put the drive shaft back in and test this car. So to do that, I have a new centering support bearing, a new cap, a new clip, and in the front where we mate with the transmission, I've got a new guibo. The rubber disc that transfers power and allows for flex, the rubber flex disc, what was there had a lot of wear to it. So I'm going to put a new one of those on as well to hopefully we have better transmission of power and we won't have the thumping at low speed when the drive shaft's working its hardest to make things spin. So we're going to take this retainer cap off. We'll be able to separate the two halves of the drive shaft. If your drive shaft isn't already marked, you want to make sure you do, because the drive shafts were balanced together. So you want to make sure that you put it back together in the same way. We loosen this cap, and then I was able to pull the front part of the drive shaft off. So now we just need to get this clip off, and the old bushing will come off and we can put the new centering bearing on. You should take note of how this is installed, like the loop, make sure we put it on the same way. I'm pulling off the old centering bearing with the 3-arm puller. To drive the new bearing on, I got these cylinders because they would beat it on this way, and I hit it on just enough so we can see the ridge for the circlip. I made sure when we installed the new one that the deep side is towards the front of the car because it only goes on one way. I got the new clip in here, made sure that's inside the ridge. So now the bearing can't slide off during operation. Putting a new nut and nylon bushing on, making sure we're still lined up. I'm just going to make this a little bit tight and then make sure we get the right distance on the car, because this was loose when we took it off the car. So I'm not sure about the length.